Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. In today's video I want to discuss what I consider to be one of the best arguments against divine simplicity, an argument that I have called the indeterministic collapse against classical theism. In this video, I will respond to key objections against this argument. I will also offer another version of the aloneness argument, so stay tuned for that. And I will also argue for why this is all problematic for classical theism. So, the indeterministic argument states that in order for classical theists to solve the modal collapse, they must posit that God's will is causally indeterministic. But if God's will is causally indeterministic, it is not descriptive or representative of the world. That God knows contingent truths by a representational or descriptive content in his will. So therefore, God doesn't know contingent truths. Now, that's just a short rundown of the indeterministic collapse, so I will link in the description of this video the full video explaining the indeterministic collapse argument for anyone that wants to catch up. So, in this video, what I would like to do is express some of what I think are the best objections against the indeterministic collapse. However, firstly, before we get into the best objections, I want to address what I consider to be the dumbest objection to the indeterministic collapse. So, by far the dumbest objection to this argument that I have heard is when people want to deny or redefine the definition of indeterministic causation that I give in the video. There are two reasons why this is stupid. The first reason is because the definitions of determinate and indeterminate that I give in the video are mutually exclusive, and secondly, that the classical theist already implicitly affirms the core tenets of this definition regardless, which is just that God is an immutable cause, God doesn't change, and yet God's effects of his will could have possibly have been different across possible worlds. God could have refrained from creating this world, or he could have created another world, or he could have done differently. So they already affirm the core tenets of this. So anyone that gives you this response, this is just the dumbest objection. I'm sorry, it is. Okay, now let's get into some of what I think are the best objections to this argument. So one of the best objections, and one of the most common best objections that I've received, is people that want to challenge premise 3 of the argument, which states that God knows contingent truths via a descriptive content in his will. Now, although Aquinas does seem to affirm this premise, some people have wanted to step outside of the Thomistic tradition in order to answer this argument. Now, normally I would expect someone to give a model of how God necessarily knows contingent truths if they are to deny that he knows them by a descriptive content in his will. However, for this, I will even grant that you can be a Mysterian about how God knows contingent truths, and you will still fall into problems, or you will at least fall into the indeterministic collapse. And that is because we know that at least knowledge is internal, and everything internal to God, according to the doctrine of divine simplicity, is necessary. So therefore, those things, those thoughts, that knowledge that God has is going to be necessary. However, there is another way that people can get around this, and the only way that people can get around this, and this is what this objection I'm going to be addressing is putting forward, is by denying something called content essentialism, which is famously rejected by classical theists such as Grant and Timothy Paul. So, the classical theist here must deny that the contents of God's beliefs are essential or internal to God, and the view being denied here is content essentialism. The reason why this must be denied is because if it's internal, it's necessary, and then thus by transitivity of necessity, what is depicted by God's internal and necessary thoughts must be actual, otherwise God's thoughts would be false. So, of course, some people to solve this have said that these thoughts are actually external. So, what is content essentialism, the thing that they're denying here? Content essentialism implies that for any beliefs or knowings, A and B, if A and B have different content, they are not the same belief or knowing. And if a belief or knowing has a content P, there is no world in which the same belief or knowing exists without that content. Now, if we can prove that content essentialism is true, we can prove that God's knowledge couldn't have been different under classical theism, because then the content of God's knowledge or his beliefs would be internal to God and thus necessary, proving classical theism to be false. So why would someone believe in content essentialism? Let's give some justification for why it's obviously ridiculous to deny this. Well, The first reason is because content individuates beliefs from each other. So, if one wants to deny content essentialism, it seems hard to understand how one can differentiate beliefs or representational attitudes. For example, let's say that I believe that pigs can fly, and then let's say at some time later I believe that pigs do not fly. Well, if I deny that content essentialism is true, it seems that my beliefs never changed. Well, why is that? Well, because the content of the belief is the only relevant thing that has changed, according to this example. However, someone who wants to deny content essentialism, that content is essential to beliefs, cannot admit that content is a sufficient reason to say that your beliefs have changed. And therefore, it seems that content is what individuates beliefs, but you must be committed to content essentialism to believe that. So, without essential content, the metaphysics of belief and thought becomes unstable. If one and the same belief could have different contents, then we couldn't explain any rational inferences. Beliefs without essential content, therefore, also lack identity. This is not to mention that belief is obviously representational, as aboutness or intentionality is constitutive of thoughts. However, I would also like us to consider a thought experiment brought up by Joe Schmid, and this is called the non omniscient God Nog thesis. So, this asks us, remember, keeping in line with what we're speaking about before, we are using this thought experiment to debunk someone that wants to say that the content of God's beliefs is external to God. So, keep that in mind while I give you this thought experiment. So, the non omniscient God thesis states that consider a non omniscient God. This non omniscient God, Nog, is qualitatively identical to the classical theist God, except doesn't and can't have any contingent knowledge. Nog knows all and only necessary truths. Nog is thoroughly unaffected by contingency, so much that he is only aware of and only knows necessary things. Other than that, though, Nog is pure, undifferentiated actuality. Nog is numerically identical to everything in Nog across all worlds, and Nog is absolutely simple. Indeed, Nog is qualitatively identical to the classical theistic God, if you haven't noticed. Now, what makes the non omniscient God, Nog, different from the classical theistic God in a type of alone world in which they haven't created anything yet? What, in other words, explains their difference? This view seems to debar any adequate answer. Consider the classical theistic God in the alone world and the Nog God in the alone world. In extramental, non linguistic, non predicative reality, these two worlds are entirely identical. There is no difference between them. Entitatively, as it were, there's only the absolutely simple, necessary act in both of these alone worlds. And yet, the classical theist has no way of being able to differentiate, if they're a content externalist, that is, the difference between the non omniscient God and the classical theistic God in worlds in which they have not created anything, which is going to be a major problem. Furthermore, this view of content externalism, that the content of God's beliefs are external facts, implies that God does not believe these facts until they come about. So, firstly, this is problematic as before creation. Obviously, there are no facts to know, and of course, these facts can be different under contingentarianism. If the classical theist wants to ground the content of future beliefs internal to God or in God's act rather than in his effects, they just end up by accepting the third premise of the indeterministic collapse anyway, and seem to concede the argument. Further, if this idea about content externalism is true, then it seems that our beliefs seem to be less to do with our own mental states and more to do with external conditions. Some classical theists, however, want to take God's knowledge to be more of an immediate account of God's knowledge. Think of like if I were to pinch you right now, you wouldn't reason towards that proposition. You wouldn't look out into the world and see me pinch you. You would just immediately feel the sensation of the pinch. It would be like a type of immediate knowledge. So the issue with this is that we can again ask the same question. If God's knowledge is an immediate knowledge, what differentiates our knowledge, our immediate knowledge, um, between other immediate knowledges? So if I stub my toe, I have an immediate knowledge of that pain. But if I also have an immediate knowledge of something else, let's say I pinch you, what differentiates the immediate knowledge? Well, it would seem that It's the same thing. It's the content that differentiates the immediate knowledge. And here we get the same issues. What's more is that immediate knowledge is always due to something else that gives an immediate sensation, such as the sensation of stubbing my toe depends on me hammering my toe into the wall, right? And the sensation of me being pinched depends on the pincher, of course. But of course, under classical theism, we don't want to say that God's knowledge is dependent in this manner, which is going to bring up some issues. So there is also a analogy that some classical theists that I've interacted with do want to bring about from the immediate knowledge account, which I think, to be fair to them, is very clever. However, I don't think it works. So the most well-developed account of this says that it's an analogy of the reflection and a mirror. So, take for example the reflection in a mirror. The reflection can change based on the things it captures. However, that doesn't mean that the mirror itself changes. Likewise, then, therefore, it seems that God's knowledge could be different without implying that God changes. Now, in response to this, I must first note that if the scene of reflection in the mirror is internal to the mirror itself, then the mirror does definitionally change. However, if it is external to the mirror, the analogy can't work because, as we've just shown above, knowledge must be essential and thus internal to God. But of course, the only reason why the mirror doesn't change is because the change is not essential to the mirror itself. So, if we want to take this as analogous for God's knowledge, the obvious symmetry breaker here is clearly between the internal nature of God's knowledge and the external nature of the scene of reflection in the mirror. Furthermore, if this model of knowledge were true, God's knowledge would depend on that which provides him the immediate sensation of knowledge, meaning that his knowledge depends on contingent objects, just as the reflection of a mirror depends on that which it reflects. The truth makers for God's beliefs would be the contingent objects themselves. Thus, to conclude this first objection, I've shown that if one wants to reject premise 3 of the indeterministic collapse, an alternative account of God's knowledge must be presented. But for all models of God's knowledge, the content of God's knowledge must be internal to God. But if God's knowledge is internal, it is immutable, and thus for all possible worlds, God's knowledge is the same and necessary, introducing again another collapse of modality into everything being necessary. So let's look at another objection to the indeterministic collapse. So this objection states that we can deny premise 1, which is if God's will is indeterminate, then his will does not describe the contingent facts about the actual world. So some classical theists have attempted to respond to this premise by saying that, well, maybe the descriptive content of God's will is external and not internal, and thus it's not necessary. So, this seems to grant the classical theist an escape from the first conclusion that God's will does not contain any descriptive content about the world. However, according to this theory, the descriptive content of God's will must be external, and thus there would be no way of God knowing some contingent truths by his internal act, especially if we want to understand the essential nature of the contents of God's beliefs, as I've stated above. But notice that the first conclusion of the internal collapse is related to the second conclusion that God can't know contingent truths by willing them. Thus, the defender of the indeterministic collapse need not concede the argument, but may just readjust the first and third premise. They could readjust it as so, quote, if God's will is indeterminate, then his will does not internally describe the contingent facts about the actual world, and adjust the third premise to, quote, God knows contingent truths about the actual world via an internal descriptive content. And we get the same conclusion that God does not know contingent truths about the actual world. Furthermore, if we can raise similar objections to this view that can be raised against the content externalist, for example, the non omniscient God challenge could be changed to the non intentional God challenge, because obviously here we are denying that God's intentions or descriptive contents of his will or anything in his will that represents the actual world is actually internal to his will. So one could say, imagine there exists an alone world where God does not create anything. God solely wills his own being. This God is qualitatively identical to the classical theistic God, except this God can't have any contingent intentionality, extrinsic to his essence, or any contingent descriptive content external to his essence, etc., etc. Now, what makes this non intentional God different from the classical theistic God posited here? What, in other words, explains their difference? And again, this view seems to be the bar of any adequate answer to explain the difference between these gods, because in extramental reality, they are entirely identical. The final issue I propose is that if God's intentions or descriptive contents lay outside of the divine essence, it seems that God's intentions or descriptive contents come after his act, as it's not grounded in his act itself, but would be rather grounded in his effects. This, of course, creates an issue for God's providence and his independency. So, again, I want to highlight an even deeper issue now with saying that God's intentions, descriptive contents, and beliefs are external to God, because that's what these first two objections seem to be really highlighting externalist accounts of these things. So, I want to make an argument that really attacks these things. So, I've decided to syllogize an argument very inspired by Joe Schmidt's work. So, I'm going to call this argument the prior world argument. Premise one: under classical theism, there is a causally prior state, let's call this prior, in which only God exists. Premise 2. On prior, God knows which creatures he will contingently create. Premise 3. If God creates different creatures in different possible worlds, then what God knows in the respective prior states must differ. Premise 4. God creates different creatures in different possible worlds. Conclusion 1. Therefore, what God knows in the respective prior states differs. Premise 5. If what God knows in prior states differs, then God differs across possible worlds. Since in prior only God exists, so any difference must be only in God. Conclusion 2. Therefore, God differs across possible worlds. Premise 6. If divine simplicity is true, then God does not differ across possible worlds. Conclusion 3. Therefore, divine simplicity is false. Now, premise 5 is obviously the premise that the divine simplicity proponent will probably object to. However, I think this is quite reasonable to accept. Firstly, because in the prior state, only God exists, no creatures or external realities. Yet, therefore, any difference in prior cannot come from extrinsic relations to creatures, since creatures don't exist yet. Secondly, since the classical theist in denying this premise is arguing that what God knows can differ in a prior state, while God does not differ in these prior states, we can adjust Joe Schmidt's non omniscient God challenge to be a non omniscient prior state God challenge, right? So, this challenge wants us to imagine a world in which a non omniscient God exists in this prior state, and also imagine the classical theistic God existing in some prior states. Now, these prior worlds are identical in reality, as the previous analogies from before argue about. So, there again is no way for the classical theist to differentiate the non omniscient God in the prior states to the classical theistic God in the prior states. Now, we could also further extend this challenge to be a challenge about the classical theistic God differing between knowledge in World 1, perhaps he knows Napoleon crosses the Alps in World 1, and knowledge in World 2, perhaps he knows Napoleon does not cross the Alps in World 2. And again, in the prior states, there's no way of explaining how these two worlds in which God has different knowledge in the prior states, how these two worlds differ at all. Just the same. God knowing that Napoleon crosses the Alps, God not knowing Napoleon crosses the Alps, God being omniscient, and God being not omniscient, according to this, are just all the same identical reality. Lastly, I'd like to consider one last objection that I consider to be well thought through, that a classical theist friend of mine has developed, which essentially states that, and it is the objection, God eternally and unchangeably knows the proposition, quote, I know the actual world. Thus, God's knowledge does not change, as this proposition is immutable. No matter how the world could change, God could always know the proposition, I know the actual world, without that proposition itself changing. However, what the eternal act of God picks out is not an intrinsic descriptive content, but it is an extrinsic truth maker in the actual world. Firstly, in the prior collapse argument that I stated just previously, there are no extrinsic truth makers. So, if God's knowledge of the contingents that a world indexed is via extrinsic states, as is stated above, then in prior, God doesn't know what contingents will actualize. And that contradicts omniscience and providence. And we also ran into the non omniscient God challenges that Joe Schmid raises above. Now, secondly, definitionally, the phrase God knows the actual world in its meaning as what is meant by, quote, the actual world, his cross world variant, is too general. So basically, if I say God knows the actual world immutably, the phrase the actual world always changes based on the content that it designates. So I'm going to argue that this is a statement that is too general to actually represent what the actual world is. So take, for instance, the description G. Quote, the winner of the election is tall. In World 1, the content is Alice is tall. Alice won the election. In World 2, Bob is tall because Bob is the person that won the election. And in World 3, the content is Charlie is tall because Charlie won the election. Now, this is directly analogous to I know the actual world because it functions like the statement the winner of the election is tall or the winner of the election in statement G. So, for example, in World 1, the actual world can be God knows World 1. In World 2, the actual world can be God knows World 2, etc., etc. And these can be different, contradictory, even things that God could know. However, for the same reason why statement G doesn't tell us who won the election, the statement God knows the actual world doesn't tell us what the actual world is that God knows. And that's because the statement is far too general to actually pick anything out or give you any content or description about what the actual world is. So I would argue that this is insufficient to say that God can actually know what the actual world is. Lastly, a final concern for this argument is that it seems to make God's knowledge of what the actual world is dependent on extrinsic items, making God dependent in some manner. So, those are my objections to three refutations of the indeterministic collapse. I've also offered a new version of the aloneness argument, which is inspired by Joe Schmid, called the prior world argument, and have demonstrated that in order for God to know contingent truths, God must be intrinsically variable. With that being said, please let me know your thoughts below down in the comment section. With that being said, God bless.